Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we will be discussing our last target in Unit 6. We are going to be looking at factoring special products, and more specifically, we are going to be looking at factoring completely. Okay, so today we're going to be using all the different skills that we've been looking at over the last couple videos. So, I gave you in your notes, I gave you some of these key concepts, and they're little patterns to factoring some special products. If you'll remember when we were multiplying polynomials, we talked about some of these special products, and there is a pattern to them. But what I'm more concerned, if you don't recognize this pattern, and the pattern is in this diagram right here, if you don't recognize that pattern, I want you to still be using the box that we have been using. So, I got a couple examples for you. These are in your notes. Got 9b to the fourth minus 25. These first two examples, we're going to be looking at factoring differences of squares. If you'll notice, my two terms are perfect squares, and then they got a subtraction sign in the middle. So you got to ask yourself, what do I square to get 9b to the fourth? Well, that's 3b squared. And I square that, right? Because 3b squared is 9b to the fourth. And then what do I square to get 25? I square 5 squared. And so the pattern is saying, well, my answer is going to be 3b squared minus 5 and 3b squared plus 5. So that's what the pattern is saying, and that's what my factors are. However, if you can't see that pattern, then that's fine. I want you to use the box. So let's start over. I've got 90b to the fourth minus 25. So if I look at my box, I'm going to put the first term up into the upper left-hand corner, the last term in the bottom right. So I've got 9b to the fourth and I got negative 25. I'm going to multiply those together and I get negative 225b to the fourth. So to fill out the rest of my box, I need to find two numbers that multiply to give me negative 225b to the fourth, and add to give me that middle term. Well, where is the middle term? Well, I've got 9b to the fourth plus 0b squared minus 25. Because that middle term, that exponent, is always going to be half of what your leading degree was. So that's going to be 0b squared. Well, what two terms am I going to look for? So I'm going to list those factors and I'm going to figure out the two numbers that multiply to negative 225 and add to 0. Well, that's going to be negative 15b squared and 15b squared. So I'm going to fill the rest of my box in. Factor out the GCF. So I'm going to make this right here. I'm going to make that a little smaller to get out of my way. I'm going to factor out the GCF. In the first, I get 3b squared. In the bottom, I get 5. In the top, I get 3b squared. In the second column, I get minus 5. So my two factors are 3b squared minus 5 and 3b squared plus 5, which is what we got when we used the pattern as well. All right, now if I look at my second example here, it's number 3 in your notes, but I'm going to put it with factoring difference of squares. If I use my if I use the pattern from up here, what do I square to get 121? Well, I square 11. What do I square to get c to the fourth? I square c squared. So that first term is a product of a square. And then I have minus, what do I square to get 1? I square 1. And then what do I square to get d to the third? Well, there is no number here. There is no number that when I square it, I get 3, an exponent of 3. So this doesn't work, so this is a prime polynomial. Again, if you use the box like we have been, these are going to be okay. If the pattern's a little bit confusing, it's going to be the same thing. If I put, that's the bell. If I put 121c to the fourth, I put negative 1d cubed. I need to find two numbers that multiply to give me negative 121 c to the fourth d to the third. And there's no numbers out there that are going to multiply together to give me an exponent that's odd. So that's just not going to work with the way we've been doing things. So don't worry about that. And again, my examples here are probably going to be a little bit more complicated than what you'll see. But just want to expose you to them. The second pattern is a perfect square trinomial. And we dealt with these two. We dealt with multiplying these back a couple videos ago. So now we're looking at factoring or breaking down that multiplication. So same idea. I want to just use a box. If I use a box in number 2, example 2, I got 25x squared, I've got 9. So I need to find two numbers that multiply together to give me 225x squared. So they need to multiply to that, and they need to add to give me negative 30x. So I figure out that since they multiply to a positive and add to a negative, they both have to be negative. So I get negative 15x and negative 15x. So when I put those back into my box and I factor out the GCF on the rows and the columns, I notice that my terms, or sorry, not my terms, that my factors are the exact same. So when you have that same factor being multiplied together, I can simplify that answer to give me 5x minus 3 quantity squared. Now if we go to number 4, I'm going to give myself a little bit more room here. If I go to number 4, I don't have to necessarily use the pattern up above. Instead I can use a box. Box is always going to work. I've got 4y squared and 1. So they multiply together to give me 4y squared, and they add to give me that middle term of 4y. So what two things multiply to 4y squared and add to 2y? Well, that's going to be 2y and 2y. So now when I factor out the GCF on the rows and the columns, I'm going to get 2y plus 1 times 2y plus 1. Well, those are the same things, so that's going to be 2y plus 1 squared. Continue practicing that box. Continue using it. So now I'm going to get to what the main part of today's lesson is, and that is factoring completely. So remember, we always have to look for a GCF first. Then we factor by grouping if we need. If there are 4 terms, so remember, factor by grouping, that's if I've got 4 terms. And then we look for perfect square trinomials or a difference of 2 squares, which is the type of examples we just did. And then if we have those, or if we don't have those, either way, we are going to, for steps 3 and 4, we're going to use our box method. So let's look at number 1. Do I have a greatest common factor between negative 27g to the third and 3g? Yes, my greatest common factor is negative 3g. And I'm left with 9g minus 1. Sorry, that should be a g, not a q. 9g minus 1. So now what I need to, I keep messing up. Take 2. My GCF is negative 3g. And then I'm left with 9g squared minus 1. Okay? So now what's new is I need to look at this. I need to look at what's left over and see if I can factor that further. So I'm going to go to my box. I've got 9g squared and negative 1, so they need to multiply to give me negative 9g squared. And they need to add to give me 0g. Well, those two numbers are going to be 3g and negative 3g. So then if I factor out the GCFs on the rows and the columns, I've got my GCF, which is coming along for the ride, and then I've got these binomials, which I found by using my box, by factoring what was left over. All right, I think we've done something like that before. Let's look at number 2. What is the first thing I look at? I look at a GCF of all the terms. So I've got 2w cubed minus 6w squared minus 18w plus 54. Is there something that goes into all 4 terms? Yes, I have a 2. So I need to factor out that 2, and I'm left with w cubed minus 3w squared minus 9w plus 27. So now I factored out the GCF, so that part's done. Now step 2, factor by grouping if needed. I've got 4 terms, so I can factor by grouping. I'm going to group the first 2, I'm going to group the last 2. So the GCF is coming along for the ride, and then when I start factoring by grouping, I've got w squared, and what's left over? W minus 3. And then I can factor out a minus 9, and I've got w minus 3 left over. These 2 things are the same, so I drop the 2. I factor out w minus 3 because they have that in common. Now I got w squared minus 9 left over. But here's where I got to stop, and this is where it gets a little tricky because you always got to make sure you're done. I can't factor anything else out of the 2. I can't factor anything out of w minus 3. But w squared minus 9, that's a difference of 2 squares. So then I go back to my box. I got w squared up here, negative 9 down there. So they need to multiply to negative 9w squared, and they need to add to 0w. And we just did that over in the other example. That's going to be 3w and negative 3w. So after I factor out everything, I drop the greatest common factor. I've got this factor of y minus 3. I've got w squared minus 9 simplified to y minus 3 and w plus 3. And then if you'll notice, I have 2 factors that are the same. So I've got 2 times w minus 3 squared times w plus 3. And that's my final answer. So this problem right here that we just did is probably going to be as complicated as we're going to get, but I think it nails down the point that you have to do each of these steps, and then you always have to double check to make sure that you're not missing anything. So like at the beginning, had to look for a GCF. And then I factor by grouping, and then I look at those remaining factors to see if I can break that down, which I could at w squared minus 9. And then here, you'll notice that I've got 2 factors are the same, so I can simplify that even further. So that's probably going to be as complicated as it's going to get, but really it's nothing new today. You're still using the box, it's just literally combining everything we've done over the last several videos. So I think I've got 3 or 4 you try now problems for you. Go ahead and knock those out. We will go over those in class. As always, be good and be safe, do some good, and I will see you when I see you.